So, this week we're going to be looking at one of the strangest books in the Old Testament. You see no direct acts of God. It's not even written about Jews in Jerusalem. There's no mention of Jerusalem at all. The name of the Lord isn't even said. And the people are heroes, aren't exactly the greatest paragon, aren't completely perfect paragons. There is a lot of debate about how moral all these people really are. Should we really be holding them out as examples for people to follow? But we'll get into that a bit more. But first, some basic information. The author is kind of a question mark. The leading theories are that Mordecai himself wrote it. This is especially prevalent among certain Greek cultures where in the old Greek tradition they had additions to the book of Esther that had Mordecai having visions that made him a prophet and thus would allow him to write this with inspiration from God. The other leading theory was that you had records, and then it was written later on by Ezra, looking back and seeing how God delivered his people. Always the option that it's just someone that we don't know. But if it's someone who is listed in Scripture, tradition says either Mordecai or Ezra. However, Mordecai is a little iffy about how much that would be accepted into the canon, and if it was written by Ezra, it would be a very purposeful, it would be even more a work of art than it is already. Because this is very much not his usual style that's in Ezra. It has a lot of parts that are very intentionally constructed. Things like the absence of the name of the Lord, for example. But before we get on to...
I thought that was one of the prerequisites of being in the Bible, that it had to have something to do with, or it had to mention Christ. It had to.
So we'll kind of get into that in the first discussion question, but this, suffice to say that in many conservative Jewish circles, Esther is considered kind of suspect because it does not directly mention the name of the Lord, but there is definitely hints about him working behind the scenes. And as we look at it, we can see that, yeah, God is in this, even though the people in the story don't see it. It is very much not the usual. It very much sets itself apart from the rest of the books of the Bible. And I and many others feel that it is done very intentionally to make a very specific point, which we'll get into with the themes. But first, who is this for? Ultimately, this is for Jews in exile and the Jews who, even though they returned home, it never really felt like they did. And it's to show them that even when they don't see all these big miracles that are recorded in the scripture, God is still at work. Even though we don't see God descending with some angels to give healing to the righteous sick, or to kind of swerve your car away from danger, God is still at work and always helping his people. And how does this show this? Part of this is what sets it apart. It takes place in Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, about, I don't remember the dates, about 2 generations after the Edict of Cyrus and the first exiles returned home. So these are not the ultra-religious of the Jews that we're following. Another thing that was mentioned before, God is not mentioned by name or title anywhere directly. Yet we see him constantly hinted at with all of the little coincidences, we'll call them, that take place. All the little subtle ironies that occur throughout Scripture, where it's just this little thing falling in the right place, and in the end, as you look back, you see that it's almost like a Rube Goldberg machine in order to have this God-pleasing result at the end. And kind of the highlight is in the end of Mordecai chapter 4. Did I say Mordecai? Esther chapter 4, where Mordecai tells Esther, who knows, perhaps it was for a time like this that you were given this position. God isn't mentioned directly, but it is hinted. So, before we move on, any other questions, comments?
Time of writing? What did you say the time of writing?
Time of writing, we know that the events occurred about 480 to 473. The time of writing, depending on who you think is the author, would be either a little after 480 if it was Mordecai, or sometime in the later 4th century BC. Any questions, Ellen? Okay, you're muted if you wanted to say anything.
When you say the 4th century BC.
Nope, we're good.
Okay. So that's about closer to 300 than 400.
Yeah, my book said anywhere from 341 up to 480.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on who wrote it.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the interesting things about this book is that it kind of forms a curve, an arc, where you have a lot of interesting parallels as things go down to meet. It starts out with the glory of this foolish, godless king, Artaxerxes, where he's throwing this great, extravagant feast where everyone's getting drunk off their horses, and the goblets are made of pure gold, the silver is flowing abundantly, and then in all his foolishness and hastiness, he decides, hey guys, I want to show off my wife. My wife is just so beautiful. You gotta check her out. Let me call her in even though she's busy hosting her own party for your wives, yeah, let's just drag her away from that. I mean, she has to obey. I'm the king, and I'll make sure that she obeys. But then she didn't. And the king, being both drunk, hasty, and very proud of himself, decides, well, if she's not going to listen to me, then I'm not going to keep her around. Let's just kick her out. And so the king deposed the queen, just about exiled her from his presence, and then he traipsed off to go on his grand military expedition that was planned with all of his highest generals and copious amounts of wine, only to have that grand plan fail, and he ran back with his tail tucked between his legs, and he wanted to have some, shall we say, wifely comforts. And he kicked out his wife, so he was in the market for a new one. And so, what's a king to do after he's kicked out his wife, and he already rules pretty much all of the empire, so there's not really anyone who'd be equal to his station that he'd be able to quick vie for a queen. He decides, you know what? I don't need the extra clout from taking nobility. I'll just round up everyone in the city. We'll have a giant beauty pageant, and then I'll just choose my favorite, and then she'll be the new queen the new favorite concubine. And then this is where we get introduced to our main characters. Mordecai, which is, as much as we've gotten used to it as just the name of a good Jew, it is actually a very Persian name, because it is essentially Marduk-Kai. This is not a Jewish name. It was very much a Persian name. And then Esther, well, that's Ishtar. And so, with these very Persian names, and generally pretty Persian way of living, Esther, even though she's a Jew, blends in with all the other beauty pageant contestants, and eventually the Lord is with her, even though it's not directly said, and she is selected as the king's new favorite. And as things keep going up and up, the pieces just keep getting set up. As Mordecai is spending the time checking up on his cousin, he happens to overhear a plot to assassinate the king. And he passes that along to Esther, who passes it along to the king, and Mordecai is honored in the king's presence as well. One more domino set up along the road. But then we meet our main villain, Haman. Haman, the Agagite, or alternatively, if you're reading the Greek, the Old Greek, he's called a Greek, which for Persian means an enemy. Haman, his defining characteristic is that he's honored by the king and he hates Mordecai. And so when he finds out that, hey, that Mordecai guy is a Jew, like, Jews are kind of weird. We can find something against them. And so he goes to the king, who, as ever, is very hasty and impressionable, and says, hey, there's these weirdos in your kingdom that aren't worshipping the same God as everyone else. Let's kill them. And the king's like, well, that sounds reasonable. And so, Mordecai hears what's going to happen, and he starts seeing how all the pieces were put in place. He goes to his cousin, Queen Esther, and pleads for her help. Maybe this is what you were given this position for. And so, things keep getting set up. Then, Esther makes her first request. She sets up the first banquet. Haman and the king and the court are all invited to a special banquet. And after a good amount of boozing up, Haman is going home to his house and he sees, oh man, that Mordecai not giving him the respect he deserves. So he decides, you know what, I'm going to stick it to him especially. I know I'm going to kill all his people, but I want something special for him. So he, with some input from his family, depending on the translation, he sets up a pole or a gallows, as the King James Version called it, in order to kill Mordecai with some special honor. Then things start turning around. And the turning point is Esther chapter 6, where in this almost comedic scene, we see Haman coming to the king, expecting to receive more honor for himself, but the dominoes that were set up were starting to fall. The king wanted to honor Haman's enemy, Mordecai. And Haman was the one who decided what that honor was going to be. And so, Haman, humiliated, while Mordecai is honored. And then, in 7, things start going worse and worse as there is another feast hosted by Esther, but this time, rather than going on with Haman setting up the special murder of Mordecai, Haman gets his comeuppance when Esther reveals her heritage, and the king in his rage goes out, sees that pole, and decides, you know what, for someone who wanted to kill my favorite queen, that's the perfect execution method. And Haman is hoisted on his own pole. But the irony just keeps going as the king, in the previous side of Mordecai's honoring, made a hasty edict to destroy the Jews. Now he makes an edict in order to save the Jews and let them destroy their enemies. And then we see the triumph of the Jews, and it concludes with Mordecai, this wise Jew, and all of the glory that he has to contrast with the king's foolish displays of glory. You can kind of see how it parallels and how all the dominoes fell in a row in a way that no human would ever be able to see it coming, but with God's hand, everyone was in just the right place at just the right time. Any questions before we get on to the discussion questions? There we go. Okay.
So when Esther invited Mordecai, invited Haman and the king, wasn't he found by the king in a compromising position, and that's why he was
Yes. So there are a lot of interesting ways of making oaths and appealing for aid, it's assumed that what Haman was trying to do was basically throw himself at her feet, but after being very bruised up between him and himself being drunk and the king being drunk and hasty, that can not look particularly great when you're doing it to the queen. Yeah, in the Odyssey, the way that, just to give an impression, the way that someone asks for help is they kneel down in front of you, put one hand on the knee and the other on the chin, which is awkward looking, and when you're doing it to the queen, yeah, that looks pretty gory.
The king explained, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?
Mm-hmm.
Take him away.
And after all that we looked at how God perfectly set everything up to deliver his people, why is there so much hesitancy to accept this as part of the canon? A big part of it is the lack of the Lord's name. He's never referred to directly at all. And all of the things that set it apart is not following the Jews, it's not following the religious Jews, it's not concerned with Jerusalem. There's not even, in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, there's not even any direct mention of praying, just of fasting. And the people are not the most morally upright. I've heard it described that Esther is a woman who slept her way to the top, and Mordecai is incredibly unpracticing, hides his Jewishness. Contrast that with Daniel, who, even though the king demanded that, yeah, you're not going to, even with Daniel, when the king demands, don't pray to anyone else, Daniel continues praying to the Lord. Yet Mordecai, no one seemed to know he was a Jew until it came up very tangentially. And even then, we see the parallel with the king's feasts, that there was probably quite a good amount of boozing there as well. And not to mention the festival of Purim, which means dice, to remember. Keep it brief. Festival of Purim, named after the dice that Haman rolled to decide the day that the Jews were supposed to be killed, and that kind of became the symbol of God directing things for his people. It seems like chance, but ultimately God is in control. But conservative Jews would say, what authority does Mordecai, the Persian, have to institute a new festival that's supposed to be celebrated for all of God's people? Not to mention the fact that the way it's celebrated isn't with the same austerity as the traditional festivals, where they have to live in tents or have to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Most of the time when Purim is celebrated, it's celebrated with pastries and getting drunk. It's basically the early Jewish version of St. Patrick's Day. But ultimately, we can see how God directs things for his people. Even when it's not obvious that he's there, we can still see his hand, and Esther is an artful example of that. Kind of talked about the comedy of Esther, in the sense that it has a happy ending, and also all the subtle ironies that go about in there. Artaxerxes, he is presented as foolish, drunk, hot-headed. He thinks he's in control, but from a narrative, it's obvious that he's being controlled by, well, drink, but also his advisors. Out of the narrative, we can see ultimately God's just using him as a tool to accomplish his plans. We talked about the festival of Purim. Now, the Greek additions to Esther, this is kind of a long one. So, Esther and Daniel are the two books that have significant variances between the Hebrew Masoretic text that was passed along and studied by the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Jews, all that, contrasting with the Old Greek, which would have been the popular, widespread translation of it, where if you were in a synagogue, the Masoretic text would have been used. But if you were just at home and you wanted to look something up, you probably would have used the Old Greek. And this was true all the way up to even Jesus' time. But with some of these books, the Old Greek had additions, or alternatively, depending on which way you view it, the Masoretic text had subtractions. There were two major themes that are included. The first theme is kind of call it the main characterizing of Mordecai. As for us, the name of the book is Esther. She's the mover and the shaker. She's the one who actually got stuff done. But in the Old Greek, the book doesn't start with the king exiling the queen to make room for Esther. It starts with Mordecai having a vision about two dragons fighting. And then at the end, he interprets the vision to be about him taking down Haman and saving the Lord's people.
And that was left out of what we know.
It's debatable whether it was present in the. Choose my words carefully. So, most historians are rather doubtful that it was in the original text as it was written. It seems that, first of all, it would have originally been written in the Hebrew, so why would the original language, cut it out while this translation keeps it? And furthermore, it very much changes the focus. The thought is, in addition with the other edition where they have prayers from Esther and Mordecai that pious them up, shall we say, rather than just having them be these foreign named people who seem to, by their own cunning, make their way to the top. Makes it very clear where Esther, before she goes to the king, stops and says a prayer to the Lord, saying, I am humble and I did not wish for this. O Lord, be with me as I try to save your people. And Mordecai has his own prayer, talking about how he is humble and a servant of the Lord. And going from the characterization that seems to be in their names and actions in the Masoretic, it seems much more likely that the Greek added it to try to make it more palatable, shall we say, where it's legendary additions added on so that kids don't get the idea to try to follow these not particularly the less than total paragons of godliness. And part of that is another one of the reasons why modern, why it's kind of suspect, because there's such large additions. But when you read the Hebrew, it has a nice flow, a nice symmetry, and the Greek really interrupts the flow a lot in places, changes the focus, and it does not seem to be original. It would, you might call it a, trying to think of a good analogy, almost like a VeggieTale version of it, where it's, you get a lot of things added in. You have the don't try this at home almost, where, all right, kids, be godly, say your prayers, but it takes away from the tone and format of the rest of it. And I think we touched on the moral ambiguity of Esther.
I was wondering what you meant by that. Because Esther, she had a choice.
Yeah. So there is. Choose my words carefully. Ultimately, the king has heavy influence, but if Mordecai had his eligible cousin married off to a good Jewish man like he should have, this wouldn't have happened. And Esther, and he told his cousin, hide your Jewishness, don't display it, which does allow it to all come to pass, but most people would say, really? Really, Mordecai, you're telling her to not show her faith?
I know the king was very powerful, and she was even afraid for her life. Just to talk about him, he could say, kill her. So I was thinking a lot of that had to do with fear of the king, but not necessarily.
Yeah, there's some debate whether her two feasts were hesitancy versus strategy. And there's, in addition to the way that Purim is celebrated, where that kind of excess doesn't come out of nowhere, it is ultimately their leaps and bounds better than, there's still leaps and bounds better than most of the so-called heroes of the world around them, who are only called heroes because of how much power they have while being terrible people. But when you compare it to someone like Daniel, who is incredibly upright, yeah, Mordecai, not quite A+ material.
So because of their denying or not agreeing with the Jews, not practicing Jews.
Yeah.
That was a moral issue.
Yeah.
Was there any more?
The non-practicing as well as the amount of excess that seemed to be taken that they participate in the excess of the court.
But that would have Esther and Mordecai, wouldn't it?
Esther with the 2 feasts that she throws, again, there is debate whether they want to take that as strategy or unnecessary indulgence, but this is ambiguity.
I forgot, when I read it, I forgot the idea that it was a leaving party. I guess I never realized it was about to leaving party.
Yeah, the court of Artaxerxes was famously exorbitant. As the generations went on, the amount of money that was spent on royal indulgence very much went up from generation to generation, which eventually weakened them enough that we'll get to this in Daniel, but weakened them eventually for the Greeks, specifically Alexander, the very young conqueror of a whole lot, to sweep through and take over and be welcome, because better than these money-grubbing thieves. And then one more comment on Haman the Agagite. It seems kind of weird that this guy is called an Agagite. What does that even mean? The leading theory, especially considering that the Greek translation translated it to Greek rather than keeping it rather than transliterating it, the leading theory is that he is an Amalekite, essentially, a descendant of King Agag from the first Samuel, who Saul was supposed to kill, but did not. And he was essentially carrying on that line. Alternatively, there was a district that was called Agag, however you want to pronounce it, that would represent that same kind of area that he might have been from. Because with a lot of dynasties not always being the most stable, sometimes even if you're not directly blood related, the names can stick and you can inherit the cultural legacy without having blood legacy. But either way, he is an enemy of God's people. Anything else on Esther?
So was she the actual queen? She was. This time is that part of his era.
Yes, she was the favorite, would be the technical term. Because, yes, she wasn't the only wife. There were pretty much all the girls that got brought in were sent to the harem. And she was selected as the favorite. She would have more influence than the other girls in the harem, but it's not that her child would by necessity become the next king. It's just that yeah, I like you, you're treated the best, and all the other girls vie against her.
And if she fell in favor,
Then, yeah.
because Queen Vashti was
Mhm.
favorite, not necessarily a leader of any
Mhm.
kind. Okay.
If she fell out of favor, she probably wouldn't have been kicked out the same way Vashti was, but it would have been entirely possible that someone else would have risen and become the favorite. And there's a lot of history of comparing, of trying to say, okay, who does this fit to in history with the chronology that we've been given? And we don't have too many sources because that was a while ago with the collapse with Alexander sweeping through and kind of cleaning house, and then his empire collapsing into four. There was a lot of instability, and record keeping was not always great, so pretty much there's only one guy who we're trying to compare this against. All right. Anything else before we close with prayer? All right. Lord, you are always at work, even when we do not see your hand. Help us to continue to walk by faith, trusting you, even though we do not see the great and grand signs, because we know that you have won our salvation, and you have given us your promise that no matter what happens in this life, you will work it for the eternal good of those who love you, who have been called according to your purpose. In your name we pray.